On the muddy road in the midst of despair, Hannah met Daniel Harper, a man who had fought alongside Thomas. He offered to help not out of pity, but out of a debt of gratitude, taking her and the baby to a safe haven. Faced with such sincerity, Hannah finally took the outstretched hand, then followed Daniel out of the rain and started a new turn in her life. The rain came down in gray sheets, a steady drumming that had not let up since dawn. Over the small churchyard of Dust Hollow, the sky sagged heavy and metallic, the color of hammered iron. Mud sucked at boots and wagon wheels every step and effort, as mourners gathered in black coats and shawls for the burial. The air smelled of wet cedar and freshly turned soil mingled with the smoke of damp wood smoldering in stoves back along Main Street. At the edge of the grave stood Hannah Whitfield, her face pale beneath the dripping edge of her bonnet. She held her newborn son against her breast, wrapped tight in a blanket that could not keep the chill from seeping in. The baby stirred, pressing his cheek into her damp dress, and she shifted him slightly, her arms aching from the effort of holding him so long. Yet her eyes never left the pine box, lowering slowly into the earth. Her husband lay inside Thomas Whitfield, the only man who had ever stood at her side without hesitation. The preacher's voice trembled over the patter of rain speaking of eternity and the dust returning to dust. A few townsfolk bowed their heads, some from true sorrow, others simply out of duty. On the far side of the grave, Hannah's mother-in-law, Eleanor Whitfield, stood rigid, her back straight as a fence post despite the storm. Her black dress clung to her shoulders, rain slicking the fabric like polished stone. Not once had Eleanor's expression softened. Her lips pressed into a tight, unbroken line as though she had already decided what would follow after the final shovelful of earth. When the preacher's words fell away and the first clod of wet dirt struck the coffin lid, the sound echoed like a verdict. Eleanor stepped forward, not toward the grave, but toward Hannah. Her heels sank into the mud without slowing her stride. She stopped close enough that Hannah could see the rain trailing down her stern cheekbones. From this moment on, Eleanor said, her voice slicing through the storm, "You are no longer part of this family. You will gather your belongings and leave." Gasps rustled through the cluster of mourners. The preacher faltered, his Bible half closed, unsure if he should speak. Hannah's throat tightened. "Mrs. Whitfield, you heard me." Eleanor's tone was as sharp as the edge of a blade. "My son is in the ground because he tied himself to the wrong blood. You brought nothing but hardship, and now it ends. Take the child if you must, but you will not stay another day under my roof." Some nodded reluctantly, unwilling to cross Eleanor's iron will. Others turned their gazes away, ashamed to witness cruelty dressed up as righteousness. One woman whispered to her neighbor, "A shame, but that kind of blood never takes root." Hannah bent her head, blinking back the water streaming down her face, though whether it was rain or tears she could not tell. The Whitfield foreman trudged forward carrying a battered trunk and a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. He let them fall at her feet with a thud that splashed mud up her skirts. "That's all you brought into this family," Eleanor said coldly. "It will do for wherever you end up." The pitying eyes of the preacher's wife met hers, but no one stepped forward. Not one hand reached to steady her. Hannah drew her shoulders back, tightening her hold on the baby until he whimpered against her chest. With her chin high, she gave Eleanor no reply. Instead, she turned away from the grave, away from the murmurs and whispers, and walked down the hill with her trunk dragging behind her. The muddy track leading from the churchyard seemed endless, each step weighted by despair. The rain eased to a cold drizzle, yet the damp clung to her dress like chains. At the edge of town, the crossroads stretched before her east toward the flatlands, west toward the jagged hills. Both directions led to nowhere she belonged. She paused, rocking the baby gently as he whimpered, pressing a kiss to his tiny forehead. The sound of hoofbeats broke the silence. Slow, steady, measured against the sucking mud. Hannah turned her heart, quickening, unsure whether to feel fear or hope. From the gray horizon emerged a lone rider, his bay gelding sure-footed despite the slick ground. The man's frame was lean but strong, his shoulders draped in a trail-worn coat, his hat brim low against the drizzle. As he drew nearer, his features came into view, sharp, weathered lines, eyes steady and unreadable. He reined in a few feet from her, tipping his hat politely. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of a man accustomed to hard truths. Hannah straightened her arms, tightening around the baby. "You've heard, then," she murmured, her words raw. The man nodded once. "News travels fast in Dust Hollow. I'm sorry for your loss." His gaze flicked to the child before returning to hers, his expression calm but not unkind. "Where are you headed?" "I don't know," Hannah admitted, the words tasting bitter. The rider dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the mud. He stood before her as though time itself had slowed, as though he would wait until she chose to speak again. "Name's Daniel Harper," he said. "I rode with Thomas once. He saved my hide more than once out on the trail." Hannah's brows furrowed. "Why are you here?" Daniel's eyes held hers steady and unflinching. "Because Thomas would have done the same for me. He had my back when others wouldn't. Seems only right I look after his family now." Her chin lifted sharply. "I don't need charity." His brow arched slightly, though his tone stayed even. "Charity is given out of pity. This isn't that. The town's a long ride in this weather, and your boy's already shivering. I'm offering a dry roof and a fire. That's all." She hesitated, rain dripping from her bonnet. The emptiness around her pressed close, and for the first time since the morning, she felt someone standing between her and the void. Daniel bent to lift the trunk, hoisting it with one arm as though it weighed little. He secured it across his saddle, then extended a calloused hand toward her. "You can decide what comes next once you've warmed up," he said simply. Hannah's pulse thudded in her ears. The baby whimpered again, his tiny fist pushing against her dress. With trembling resolve, she placed her hand in Daniel's. His grip was steady, anchoring her against the storm. He helped her onto the gelding, then mounted behind her, his coat wrapping warmth against her chilled shoulders. Without another word, the horse set into a slow lope, carrying them west toward the dark outline of the hills. The road blurred beneath them, and for the first time all day, Hannah allowed her weary eyes to close the steady rhythm of hooves and the solid presence at her back, pulling her toward something she had not felt since before the coffin lowered into the earth safety, however fleeting it might be. The crackle of fire greeted Hannah when she opened her eyes again. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, the warmth on her skin, the soft quilt draped across her shoulders, the heavy silence broken only by the faint simmer of a kettle. Then she remembered the horse, the rider, the rain. She sat upright, quickly, heart racing, scanning the dimly lit room. There near the hearth, her son lay safe in a wooden cradle tucked beneath a knitted blanket. His tiny fists rested near his face, his breathing soft and even. Kneeling beside the cradle was Daniel Harper, adjusting its position so the fire's glow reached the infant. His broad back filled the space, his movements careful, as though the cradle carried the weight of more than wood and nails. "That belonged to my sister Daniel," said without turning. His voice was steady, low softened by memory. Been locked away since she passed. Figured it was time it saw use again. Hannah's throat tightened. She hadn't expected more than a dry corner or maybe a chair near the fire. This felt like something older, something kept safe for years until the right moment returned. She swallowed and managed a quiet, "Thank you." Daniel stood and set a heavy mug on the table near her. Steam curled upward, carrying the smell of herbs and warmth. "Kettle's on. Drink this before you think about standing. Weather's dropping colder tonight." She took the mug with trembling hands, the heat seeping through her fingers. The tea scalded her tongue, but she welcomed the burn. It meant she was still here, still fighting. The next day dawned pale and sharp, the frost silvering the grass outside. Hannah rose early, her shawl wrapped tight to find Daniel already at work in the yard. He moved with the rhythm of habit, checking the corral, tossing hay, hammering at a fence rail that had sagged under the snow's weight. He paused, only to tip his hat in her direction before returning to the task. Inside, Hannah busied herself with the little she could do, tidying the hearth airing blankets, washing the mug and bowl she'd used. It felt strange, filling another space with her presence, yet she couldn't sit idle. More than once, she caught her gaze drift into the cradle, her baby safe and warm beneath the quilt. Each time her chest ached with a mixture of gratitude and dread. Gratitude that Daniel had opened his door. Dread that kindness could vanish as swiftly as it had appeared. By midday, she gathered the courage to speak. "I should go soon. I don't want to be a burden." Daniel looked up from where he was repairing tack, his expression unreadable. "You're not. I don't want the town saying I've taken advantage." He gave a short breath that might have been a laugh. "Let them talk. They always do." He leaned back, wiping his hands on a rag. "Thomas once stood between me and a man's bullet. Folks said plenty then, too, but his word was stronger than their whispers. Yours can be, too." Hannah lowered her gaze, uncertain how to answer. She had lived long enough to know that whispers could destroy a woman standing in Dust Hollow quicker than winter could kill a crop. 2 days later, she learned just how sharp those whispers had become. She had gone into town for medicine, the baby warm against her chest as she walked the boardwalk. Carter's Pharmacy stood at the end of the street, its windows fogged from the stove inside. She was halfway there when a familiar piercing voice sliced through the hum of the crowd. Well, if it isn't the widow, Whitfield, Eleanor called her tone cold as January. Hannah froze, turning just enough to see the older woman standing with 2 of her sons-in-law. Eleanor's eyes raked her up and down from the mud-stained hem of her dress to the shawl wrapped tight around the infant. "I see you've made yourself quite comfortable," Eleanor went on, raising her voice so bystanders could hear. "Living under another man's roof, eating his bread, sleeping by his fire. What's next? Taking his name, too." A murmur rippled through the gathering townsfolk. Hannah felt her cheeks flame, but she lifted her chin. "I'm here for medicine for my child. That is all." Eleanor's skirts swept the dust as she stepped closer. "That child carries Whitfield blood, and yet you disgrace it by hiding on Harper land like some stray. Thomas would have been sick to see it." The words struck like blows. Hannah's breath caught, but before she could form a reply, movement stirred at the edge of her vision. From between 2 wagons stepped Daniel Harper. He did not look at Hannah first. His gaze locked on Eleanor, calm but unyielding. "That's enough, Mrs. Whitfield." Eleanor bristled, her lips curving in disdain. "This is no concern of yours, Mr. Harper. It is when you speak about someone under my roof," he said evenly, stepping closer until he stood between Hannah and the Whitfields. "She is my guest. Anyone who has a problem with her will take it up with me. And if they think to push her out, they'll have to push me off my own land first." The street went silent. Even the shopkeeper froze in his doorway, the coin scale in his hand, motionless. The weight of Daniel's words pressed on the air like a gathering storm. Eleanor's fingers tightened on her parasol. You would risk your standing in this town for her. Daniel's eyes never wavered. Standing's worth less than a man's word. And I gave mine. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the nervous shuffle of boots as some bystanders stepped back. Eleanor gave a sharp sniff and turned away, her companions trailing behind like shadows. Hannah stood stunned, her satchel strap clutched so tight her knuckles whitened. Daniel finally turned his gaze softer when it found hers. "You still need that medicine." She managed a faint nod. "Then let's get it and be on our way," he said, opening the pharmacy door with a steady hand. Inside, the clamor of whispers was muffled by the scent of dried herbs and the quiet murmur of the shopkeeper. Hannah ordered what she needed, and before she could reach into her pouch, Daniel laid silver coins on the counter. She wanted to protest, but the look he gave her silenced any argument. On the walk back, she kept her gaze on the ground. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "Sure I did," he replied. "You're on my land. That makes you my responsibility." The words lingered long after they returned to the ranch, echoing in her mind as she rocked the baby to sleep. It wasn't just what he had said, but how he had said it. Like a man drawing a line in the dirt no one else dared cross. For the first time since the day of the funeral, Hannah allowed herself to wonder maybe she and her son had found not just shelter, but a place that could one day be called home. The days at Harper Ranch settled into a rhythm. Hannah hadn't expected quiet mornings filled with the smell of coffee and wood smoke, afternoons of mending, feeding, and keeping the baby close while Daniel worked the stock. At first, she kept her distance, staying indoors, not wanting to intrude. But Daniel's ways slowly drew her out, steady, practical, without expectation. He treated her less like a burden, and more like someone who simply belonged, and that unsettled her almost as much as it comforted her. It was on one of those crisp mornings, the frost still clinging to the grass, that trouble came riding down the Harper Road. Daniel had been mending a fence near the gate when the sound of hooves rose over the rustle of wind. A lone rider approached the figure, tall, in the saddle hat, pulled low his coat, thick with trail dust. As he drew near, Daniel's jaw tightened. Hannah, watching from the porch with her son in her arms, noticed how his posture stiffened, how his eyes darkened with something old and heavy. The rider swung down with an easy grin that never reached his eyes. "Been a long time, Harper." "Not long enough," Lucas Daniel replied flatly, wiping his hands on a rag. The name cut through the air like a knife. Lucas Garrison Hannah had heard the name before in hushed tones from the townsfolk. A man who had fought alongside Daniel once, then left him for dead when things turned bad. Now he stood at the Harper gate smiling like he owned the land under his boots. "What do you want?" Daniel asked. Lucas tilted his head, his gaze drifting toward the porch where Hannah stood. His smirk widened. "Heard you're still hanging on to this patch of dirt. Some folks reckon it's worth more than you'll ever get out of it. I'm not selling." Daniel's voice was calm, but his eyes burned steady. Lucas chuckled low. "Didn't think you would. But I'm here as a courtesy, letting you know there are men who don't take kindly to being told no. Men with deep pockets and short patience." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "When they want something, Harper, they usually get it. One way or another." Daniel didn't flinch. "You working for them now? Guess running off wasn't the last time you sold someone out." For a moment, Lucas's grin faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. "Careful, old friend. I'm giving you a chance to walk away without trouble. You stay. It's you, the lady, and that child who'll pay the price." The words hung in the still air, heavy as the storm clouds gathering over the ridge. Then, without waiting for an answer, Lucas tipped his hat, mockingly swung into the saddle, and rode off, dust rising behind him. From the porch, Hannah had watched every word. When Daniel finally turned, his expression softened only slightly. "Who was that?" she asked quietly. "An old mistake," he said. His voice carried weight, the kind that didn't invite more questions. But his shoulders were tight, his hands clenched just a little harder than before. Hannah didn't press him, though the unease lodged itself deep in her chest. She knew that men like Lucas didn't make idle threats. A week later, the threat came closer than either expected. The autumn winds had sharpened, carrying the promise of snow from the mountains. Daniel gathered the ranch hands, preparing to drive the cattle down from the high pastures before the pass closed. The work was hard, dangerous if left too long. Hannah had tried to protest, insisting she could help, but Daniel's brow furrowed in concern. "You don't need to put yourself in danger," he told her, saddling his bay gelding. "My father lost a wagon team once to an early slide," Hannah replied firmly. "I know the signs better than most. I'm riding." He met her gaze, saw the stubborn resolve in it, and didn't argue. He'd already learned she wasn't a woman to be swayed once her mind was set. By midday, the herd was winding along the narrow trail above Red Creek, the path little more than a ledge carved into the mountainside. Loose rock skittered down into the ravine below with every step of the cattle. The wind whistled sharp between the pines, rattling branches like bones. Hannah rode just behind Daniel, eyes scanning the slopes above out of habit. It was then she noticed it. The ridge above them scraped too clean soil, too freshly disturbed. Rocks perched at angles that seemed too deliberate. Her breath caught. "Daniel," she called over the ball of cattle. "Look up there, that ridge. The dirt's been moved." He turned in his saddle, following her gaze. His eyes narrowed. Dismounting quickly, he scrambled up a few feet of slope, crouching low. A faint metallic glint caught his eye, the frayed end of a rope buried beneath loose dirt tied to a wedge holding the rocks in place. "Lucas," he muttered, realization hardening his features. The word had barely left his mouth before a sharp crack split the air. The wedge shifted. The rocks groaned. "Move!" Daniel bellowed. The cattle panicked, bellowing and surging forward. Hannah wheeled her horse around, waving her arms, shouting to drive them clear of the narrowest stretch. Daniel leapt back into the saddle and spurred his gelding forward just as the first boulders broke free. They came crashing down with a roar, smashing against the trail, sending dust and shards of stone flying. The ground shook beneath them. For a heartbeat, the world was nothing but noise and dust and the thunder of hooves. Hannah clung to her reins, her horse dancing dangerously close to the edge, but she held firm, urging the animal to safer ground. When the last of the rocks tumbled past, silence fell heavy. The air was thick with dust, choking, gritty. Daniel turned in the saddle, scanning the ledge. Miraculously, the herd had scattered down the lower slope rather than over the ravine. "You all right?" he called. Hannah's face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "I saw it before it happened. Only because I've seen it before." He stared at her a long moment, the image of her quick thinking replaying in his mind. If she hadn't spoken, if she hadn't seen, he swallowed hard. "You saved us," he said quietly. Together, they regrouped the herd, driving them down to the valley floor before dusk. The wind had turned sharper, carrying the bite of snow. By the time they returned to the ranch, the sky was bruised purple with nightfall. As Daniel helped her down from her horse, his voice dropped low. "You didn't just see trouble. You acted. That's the difference between someone who freezes and someone who rides out alive. For the first time, his eyes met hers, not with the distance of protector to guest, but with the weight of recognition, as though he saw in her not fragility but strength. In that moment, Hannah realized something had shifted. She was no longer just the widow he had taken in out of loyalty to a fallen friend. She was a partner, whether she had chosen it or not, bound to him by more than circumstance. And the dangers gathering around the ranch would test that bond in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The storm clouds rolling over Dust Hollow that autumn weren't just weather. Beneath the surface, something bigger pressed in a kind of pressure that came not from sky or soil, but from the Denver and Pacific Railroad Company. Their ambitions stretched like steel tracks across the west, and now their gaze had fixed on Daniel Harper's northern pasture. Word spread quickly the council had called a meeting. It was no secret what for. The railroad wanted Harper's land to lay their line straight through the valley, and men in town spoke of it like progress had already been decided. Merchants dreamed of traffic, and coin ranchers dreamed of markets in Denver, and anyone who doubted the plan was dismissed as stubborn. But Daniel knew what was at stake. That pasture wasn't just grass. It was the only ground that kept his herd alive through winter. The town hall was packed to its rafters, thick with pipe smoke and murmurs. Sunlight slanted in through high windows, catching the dust motes swirling in the air. Men lined the walls, shoulders brushing hats in hand. Daniel sat in the back hat, resting on his knees, his jaw set like stone. The summons from Mayor Crenshaw had been worded politely, but the meaning was plain sell or be crushed under the weight of the council's decision. Crenshaw's gavel struck the table. Order. The Denver and Pacific Railroad has made a generous offer for the land needed to lay their track. This will bring progress jobs goods. We'd be fools to turn it down. Cheers rose from the merchant's corner. A few ranchers nodded, whispering to one another. Daniel's voice cut through, steady and unflinching. And whose land will that track run through? Crenshaw met his gaze with the confidence of a man certain of victory. Your northern section, Harper. The company's offering more than fair. It's not for sale. The room stirred. Murmurs rippled across the benches. A rancher near the front leaned back with a scoff. It's just pasture, Harper. You could buy better land closer to town. Daniel stood slowly, his boots groaning against the boards. That just pasture is what keeps my herd alive through winter. Take it, and they starve before spring. This isn't sentiment, it's survival. One of the younger councilmen shook his head. Progress means sacrifice. My family already sacrificed, Daniel shot back. His voice carried like a hammer on iron. My father built those fences with his own hands. My mother drove cattle through storms you wouldn't last an hour in, and you'd sell it all for a schedule that'll change the moment Denver says so. He slammed his hat against his palm. No, the tension was thick enough to choke on. A few men shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door. Then it creaked open, and all eyes turned. Hannah stepped inside, her baby bundled against her shoulder, her shawl damp with drizzle. The hall went quieter than a church before prayer. She crossed the room without hesitation, her boots clicking softly on the boards. When she reached Daniel's side, she stood tall behind him, the baby stirring faintly but not crying. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her presence was enough. Something in the room shifted. Men who had been leaning forward now sat back. The merchant's jeers softened into silence. The crowd no longer saw just Daniel Harper standing against the railroad. They saw a family man-woman-child facing down the weight of progress. Crenshaw's voice wavered. You'd risk this town's future for stubbornness. Daniel didn't flinch. You'd sell out your neighbors for a train line you'll never control. He swept the room with his gaze, the kind that made men look away rather than meet it. I won't sign away my father's grave or my family's pasture to strangers who've never set foot here. The mayor's mouth tightened. You're one man standing in the way. And you're a room full of men willing to bow for coin, Daniel answered. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. Silence fell heavy. Then Crenshaw banged the gavel. We'll vote. Hands rose more for the railroad than against, but not enough. The measure stalled. A groan of discontent rolled through the merchant's corner. Crenshaw's face darkened. This isn't over. Daniel placed his hat on his head. Neither am I. He stepped aside so Hannah could follow the baby asleep on her shoulder. Together, they walked the length of the hall under a dozen uneasy stares. Only after the door closed behind them did the murmurs rise again. Outside, the boardwalk glistened with rain, the air sharp with cedar, and the rumble of far-off thunder. Daniel glanced at her as they descended the steps. You didn't have to come. I know, Hannah said softly, meeting his eyes, but I wasn't about to let you stand alone. Something in his chest eased. For years, he had carried the weight of this land alone, but now, as he looked at her, holding the child against the storm, he realized the line he'd drawn in the dust stretched further than his boots. She was part of it now. The boy, too. And whether the town approved or not, the Harper land fed more than cattle, it fed a family. That night, as the rain drummed steady on the roof, Hannah sat by the cradle, her hand resting on her son's small chest. She thought of Eleanor's scorn of Lucas's threats of the council's greedy hands. And yet, here they were still standing still, holding their ground. For the first time since she'd been cast out into the mud, she dared to believe that maybe this land could truly be theirs. Daniel, watching her from the doorway, felt it too. He had given his word, and in the West, a man's word was worth more than any piece of paper. The fight wasn't over, not by a long stretch, but for the first time he wasn't fighting it alone. The Harvest Festival brought Dust Hollow alive in a way no ordinary day ever could. Lanterns swung above the main street, their golden light swaying gently in the cool evening breeze. The smell of roasted corn, sweet apples, and fresh hay filled the air. A brass band struck up lively reels near the gazebo, while children darted between booths, clutching candied apples, their laughter carrying through the crisp autumn night. Hannah stood near the edge of the crowd with her baby Samuel cradled close against her chest. Though her shawl kept her warm, she felt the weight of countless eyes lingering. They were no longer sharp with open scorn, but curious waiting. She knew why. Many hadn't forgotten the Whitfield widow thrown into the mud, and more still wanted to see what Daniel Harper might do next. For most of the evening, Daniel had kept to the background. He spoke politely with a few neighbors, tipped his hat at shopkeepers, and shared a word with the ranchers he trusted. Yet, even in his silence, people watched him. There was something about his presence that stilled the restless energy of a crowd. When the band paused between songs, Daniel began moving toward the small platform beside the gazebo. A hush rippled across the square as he mounted the steps. The fiddler lowered his bow, children hushed, and the crowd turned to listen. Daniel removed his hat, his broad frame outlined against the lantern glow. His eyes swept over the townsfolk, pausing only when they found Hannah and Samuel near the edge of the crowd. "Evening, folks." He began, his voice calm, but carrying to every corner. "You all know me. You know my land, my cattle, and the name on my deed. But there's something you might not know, or maybe you've been trying not to see. Whispers rose, then quieted. Daniel reached into his vest and withdrew a folded parchment. He held it up, the seal catching the light. "This here," he said, "is the deed to the Harper Ranch, and I've made some changes to it." A ripple moved through the crowd. Daniel stepped down from the platform, closing the space between himself and Hannah until he stood only a breath away. His gaze was steady, his words firm. "Hannah Whitfield, you've stood on that land these past months, not as a guest, but as someone who's worked, fought, and bled for it alongside me. And your boy." He glanced down at Samuel, then back at her. "He's as much a Harper as I am." Gasps spread through the gathering. Daniel unfolded the parchment and read aloud. "Samuel Harper, rightful heir to the Harper Ranch." For a moment, time stopped. Hannah's breath caught. Her arms tightened instinctively around her son. The weight of every humiliation, every whisper, every cruel glance pressed against her chest. But Daniel's voice broke through it, steady as the beat of a drum. "This land will be his one day," he declared. "And until then, it's yours to call home. No council, no company, no family will take that from you." Silence followed so deep she could hear Samuel's soft breaths. Then a single clap rang out. Another joined, and another, until the applause rolled across the square like a summer storm breaking. The cheers grew louder, warmer, the sound filling every space where doubt once lived. Hannah's eyes stung as she glanced past Daniel. At the edge of the crowd stood Eleanor Whitfield, rigid in her black bonnet. Her mouth was tight, her face pale, her eyes hollow with defeat. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Hannah saw the truth in her expression Eleanor had lost. Whatever power she once held had slipped away. Daniel turned slightly, resting one large hand on Samuel's back. He lifted his voice above the cheers. "Dust Hollow, meet Samuel Harper." The crowd erupted again, the warmth of it washing over Hannah like fire in the cold. For the first time since the day she was cast out into the mud, she felt the ground under her feet truly belonged to her. She placed her free hand into Daniel's outstretched palm without hesitation. Together they stepped forward into the lantern-lit street, the parchment in his other hand, a symbol not just of land, but of a new life. A year later, the morning sun spilled gold over the Harper Ranch, turning the rolling fields into a sea of light. The air was rich with the scent of fresh hay, the barn doors creaked open, and the sound of cattle lowed in the distance. Hannah stood on the porch, watching Daniel in the yard with Samuel. The boy, now toddling on unsteady legs, wobbled forward into Daniel's strong hands. "One step at a time, little man," Daniel murmured, steadying him. Samuel's laughter rang bright as he tried again, each step firmer than the last. Hannah's heart swelled until it nearly hurt. There had been a time she feared she would never see her child take his first steps anywhere but on borrowed ground. Now those steps fell firmly on soil that was theirs. Inside the workshop, Daniel bent over the old cradle he had once carried from storage. His carving knife scraped softly as he worked on the smooth rail. When Hannah stepped closer, she saw the letters taking shape, Samuel Harper. Each stroke was slow, deliberate carving. More than a name, it was a promise. When he finished, he brushed away the shavings. The letters stood clear and deep in the wood grain. Hannah traced them with trembling fingers. "It's perfect," she whispered. Daniel met her gaze, the same steady look he had worn the day he'd faced down Eleanor, the council, and the town. A look that carried no doubt, only truth. That evening, as the sky turned burnished copper, Daniel lifted Samuel in his arms and carried him inside. Hannah stood in the doorway, lamplight spilling warm against the coming dark. Her thoughts drifted back to the rain, to the mud, to the moment she had been cast into the street with nothing but her child in her arms. She remembered the fear of not knowing where they would sleep, the shame of Eleanor's voice cutting her down. And then she remembered the rider in the storm, the man who had stepped down from his horse and offered not pity but a hand. Her voice was soft, meant only for herself. I was thrown out with nothing but my newborn. Now I have a home, a man who calls my son his blood. Out here in the West, that's a vow stronger than any piece of paper. From inside came the gentle creak of the cradle, rocking back and forth the name Samuel Harper etched into its wood. Hannah knew then, no matter what storms might come, this place would stand. Their place, their family, their vow. In the end, Hannah's story is not only about land or survival. It is about resilience, the strength to keep walking when the world casts you out. It is about loyalty, a man honoring the memory of a friend by standing firm when no one else would. And it is about chosen family, the truth that love and commitment can create bonds stronger than blood. We all face moments when others doubt us, when whispers threaten to drown out our worth. But, like Hannah and Daniel, we can choose to stand tall, to claim our place, and to protect the ones who depend on us. That is the lesson the frontier teaches us. A home is not given. It is built step by step, promise by promise. If this story moved, you share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more tales of courage, loyalty, and love forged in the dust of the West, subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss the next chapter. Because in the wild frontier where storms rise, families fall, and courage decides who stands, every story is a fight worth telling.